Okay, this is a précis summary of my book, Movements of the Mind. Came out in OUP, Oxford University Press, 2023. This is what I'll present at the 2024 Pacific American Philosophical Association meeting, Portland, Oregon, with commentary by Sarah Aronowitz, University of Toronto, Matthew Fulkerson, University of California, San Diego, and Antonia Peacock from Stanford University, chaired by Carlos Montemayor from San Francisco State. All right, so let me give an overview of this book, Movements of the Mind, by telling you first what's in it. It presents a theory of the psychological or internal structure of agency. And I think the book should appeal to many areas of philosophy and indeed science, any area in which agency or types of agency figure as objects of theoretical or experimental investigation. You also get a theory of attention and a theory of intention as a type of memory, indeed a dynamic form of what I call practical memory. And a key move is to see the vast literature on working memory in cognitive science as giving us a perspective on intention as a dynamic state. The book is also discusses various forms of bias. And so you get a theory of internal bias, both positive and negative. And then it explains a variety of mental actions that are philosophically significant: biased attending, deducing, and introspecting. So let me now just go through and highlight some themes in the 7 chapters of the book. I'll begin with chapter 1, the structure of acting. In past papers, I've talked about the many problem, but this is just the most common version of what I call the selection problem. And the selection problem is really a problem about what actions to perform, where an action is defined by a coupling between an input and an output. The input will always be what I call mental takings. So it could be perceiving something, remembering it, thinking it, entertaining a possibility. And outputs in classical action theory are movements of the body. But because the book that I've written is focused on mental action, this will also involve outputs like applying a concept, encoding a memory, forming an image, drawing a conclusion. So outputs can be guided by inputs, and the dotted lines here mean that these actions are not yet engaged. So how do we choose? How do we select? How do we act? That's the selection problem. And now I want to introduce the notion of a bias. The bias is functionally defined as that. In this case, I'll focus on biases on input, that which gets us to the point where we solve the selection problem, i.e. gets us to action. And when we act, we respond in a way that's guided by how we take things in light of a bias. And there are many different kinds of bias. This is not an exhaustive list. But each of these is well studied in cognitive science and some of them in philosophy. So that's the basic internal structure. In chapter 1, I also present a theory of automaticity and control. Philosophy of action has been concerned with intentional actions as the paradigm form of agentive control. But I think you need a notion of automaticity to give a complete description and have a complete understanding of action. Intentional actions also exemplify automaticity. So think of the well-known case of reaching for a glass of gin that turns out to be contain gasoline or petrol. So as you reach for the glass, that exemplifies your control because that's what you intend to do. And yet the kinematics, for example, the acceleration and deceleration of your arm as you reach towards the glass, that happens automatically. You don't intend to have that kinematics, and yet your action is individuated as the action it is, that it is, because of some of those features. Well, that's fine, except if we add in a fundamental assumption in cognitive science that divides control and automaticity, takes them to be incompatible, indeed takes them to identify two types of processes, now it looks like these three claims are inconsistent. So I render them consistent and use the fact that it looks like there's a conceptual incoherence in our scheme, I use this to motivate a technical understanding of automaticity, where we have to drop the interpretation of 3 that sees automaticity and control as identifying kinds of processes, and instead focus on properties or features of actions where automaticity and control are relativized to those features at a given moment in time. And so then we can talk about features as controlled at a moment in time or a period of time if and only if the action has that feature because the agent intended to F. Otherwise, it's automatic. Okay, I think this is important. It gives you a technical vocabulary to talk about automaticity, driven by resolving apparent inconsistency. And then I think we can go back and look at these biases as sources of control. That's the intention. But most of these biases are going to be what I would call automatic bias. They lead to certain features of the action which are not intended, hence automatic. Okay. Now, I want to emphasize that the structure of action, I argue that it's a metaphysically necessary aspect of agency, a part of agency. But you can go with a weaker claim that any action that you're interested in exemplifies the selection problem. And I think that's enough. That is to say, you can take the schema, that structure, and apply it to actions that you're interested in your particular domain. So you can take the weak version and do all the work that one needs to do or would like to do. Right? So theory can help you in that respect. You don't have to accept the stronger conclusions. Now, chapter 2 focuses on attention and attending. I just want to remind you that there's a bit of skepticism in the sciences about attention. This goes back over a century. Very recently, I've argued that we know what attention is, and it's what James articulated when he was trying to give voice to folk psychology, what we all know. And again, I think I've argued for metaphysics of attention, but you can take a weaker form, the one that's expressed here, where to attend to something is that where your mind takes possession of an object. It could be one among several objects of perception or of thought. And you do this by withdrawing from the other things in order to deal with what you've selected. Okay. This is an expression of selection of a target to act on. And I've argued again that that's what attention is. But here I want to emphasize a weaker claim, which is that something entailed by the folk claim that attention is selection or action. It's just the sufficient condition. So if you mentally select a target to deal with, to act on, to respond to, then that is you're attending to it. So this is weaker than claims that I've argued for in literature. And what I want to point out is that, in fact, this is the claim upon which experimental paradigms are constructed. So in other words, folk psychology and empirical psychology converge on this condition. So this is ground zero. If you want to talk about attention, deploy attention, you don't have to settle the metaphysical issues. It's enough for you to work with this, and you'll be capturing folk psychology and empirical psychology. I can go back to the structure of action. And again, this just fits any action that you're interested in, and just do modus ponens. When you act, your mind, let's say, visually selects a target among many, withdrawing from those that you don't select, they're distractors now. And you do this in order to deal with what you select. This is an economical picture of attention. It's already embedded in agency. Okay. Chapter 3 now focuses on intention. Michael Brotman, a long time ago, mentioned the sort of inertia of intention as it sort of carries our plans into the future. And I think that this kind of inertia is a function of memory. But things really changed for me when I read this book by Miller, Galanter, and Brewer. Also, this is actually written at Stanford. And they introduced the concept of working memory into psychology. And I want you to know why they did that. They did it because they recognize that we have to retain our plans if we're going to act on them. And the function of working memory is to hold on to our plans. Now, what that opened up for me was this possibility of understanding intention through the vast amount of work on working memory. And the way I want you to see that is to take the architecture of working memory and to see it as a substratum of what intentions do to solve the selection problem. So I'm going to take Nelson Cowan's version, but architectures of working memory usually have a central executive, which I think has to store the plan because it's the central executive that is regulating working memory storage and buffers, regulating them according to plan. Okay, so in Cowan's version, working memory stores it amounts to activated long-term memory. So underneath the solving selection problem is a working memory structure with a central executive. This is the parallel to the intention. Biases, the selection here, this is the Jamesian selecting something to deal with, among many other things. The other things in working memory is activated long-term memories. And this is in the context of all these long-term memories. So you can see a parallel of solving the selection problem. Here's the point, though, that working memory is understood to be active and dynamic. And this is, if you'd like, the substrate of thinking about intention. And I think intentions themselves are also dynamic. And this comes out quite a bit in chapter 4, where I talk about intending as practical remembering, and hence as an action. So here the focus is not on intention as a bias, but intention as an input, as itself a kind of instantiating attention. And the way to think about this is that we often begin with a very abstract specification of a plan of action, right? We intend to phi. But that conception is not enough to engage with the reality and the details of the world. Now, one thing that can happen is that we might perceptually take in some target, a target that's relevant to the act that we intend. And we might then form and update our intention to intend to phi on that particular target. I call this practical fine-tuning because it's a kind of practical reasoning. So we can write it out as a practical inference where we begin with a particular course of action. We see a target or remember a target, and on the basis of that, we fine-tune our intention to be directed at that target. Okay? So there's the act of inference here, which is captured by the schema. So intention, if you like, is a kind of broadly cognitive attention, this path from more abstract to more fine-tuned. And that's what I mean by remembering, intending, right? And I think working memory is the best model of memory to capture this dynamic. In this way, intentions keep up with action through practical reasoning. And if intentions are the basis of our distinctive first personal access to action, that first personal action access is itself underwritten by reasoning of this form. Okay, that chapter 4 concludes the core of the theory, and the last 3 chapters pick up different topics. Chapter 5, if you'd like, is really an investigation of automatic bias, including implicit biases in the more narrow sense. So here's a case of implicit bias, which is the all-male panel. And I'm imagining here that the organizer has no explicit biases against women. And yet, in this recollection task, remembering possible speakers among the speakers that I know, there's a bias in memory. Now, the case that I deal with is the case of constructing a queue in Q&A. And this is a visual search task, right? You're looking for hands that are raised. And it's often, the queue often is biased in a way that reflects implicit bias. The moderator, for example, does not want to deprioritize students. And yet, as we discovered or someone noticed years ago, that in the Q&A, faculty are prioritized over students. And so we counter-biased. We created a rule that we announced at the beginning of Q&A, something like the first few questions will go to graduate students. Okay. So that's an intentional bias. But here's my point, which is that if we think about implicit bias using the structure of the selection problem, the notion of an automatic bias, this opens up a lot of interesting targets for implicit bias research. And that many implicit biases, not all, but many, are driven by biased attention. And what's nice is that the nature and operation of these biases are as clear as anything in cognitive science. That we have a good purchase on these biases. So I think that attention does provide an interesting and scrutable domain for us to understand concrete implicit biases that matter, right? Like epistemic injustice in the case of, say, bias in Q&A queues. Okay, so this sort of map of biases then gives us targets for understanding implicitly biased behavior. But it's not just negative biases, if you'd like. There are also biases that exemplify themselves in skill. So here's a task in which subjects are given x-rays, and some of the x-rays might have an anomaly, so they're really subtle. Here's an anomaly. There are also structures in the x-ray which are interesting, but are medically uninteresting. And what I want you to note here is the heat map of fixations across 4 categories of individuals. They're the naive observers who have no medical training, and then first-year residents, third-year residents, and then expert radiologists. This is work done by Donovan and Litchfield. What I just want you to notice is that the fixations, which are a proxy for eye movements, which are a proxy for attention, just show very different patterns. And the point here is that learning leads to a bias on how we attend, which is exemplified in these 4 panels. Okay, so a lot of these issues about automatic bias, both in experts and the less expert, are unpacked. In chapter 6, I turn to deducing, reasoning. There are 2 broad themes. A big chunk of the chapter deals with deduction in terms of semantics. And there I show how deduction is non-ampliative because it involves the narrowing of cognitive attention to propositions that one has in view. I also talking about the learning of certain kinds of logical knowledge and logical schemas and how this sharpens attention to logical form needed to do proofs adequately. But the thing I want to highlight here is an old problem from Lewis Carroll. Now, one of the big sort of themes in the book is that it's important to understand the structure of action to understand specific actions, like deducing. If you remember, Carroll's problem, challenge, was that how do we understand the use of rules? Because it looks like if we need to invoke a rule as another premise, we'll end up in a vicious regress. That's what the tortoise gets Achilles to do. For every rule that he comes up for the inference, he writes it in his notebook, which is to say he's using it as a premise. And then the tortoise gets him to write another rule and so forth ad infinitum. Now, one response to this has been to say that, look, what we have to do is to have the use of rules be implicit, not explicit. And to this, in the book, I say that's fine, except that there are clearly cases where we do explicitly use rules. And those are the cases in which the paradox or the regress begins. So the thing about having the structure of action in view is that that's not the only functional role for rules. Knowledge can also just be a bias. And the answer that Achilles should give to the tortoise is just that the tortoise has conflated inputs and biases. So the tortoise sees that the rule can only play the role of an input or a premise. Achilles then need only not write the rule in the notebook and just assert, because Achilles has read movements of the mind, that the rule can function merely as a bias. And that's a distinctive functional role. Okay, the last chapter concerns introspection. Now, I'm not an introspection skeptic, but I think introspection is like perception. Sometimes it's accurate and reliable, sometimes it's not. The thing to do is to figure out what those contexts are when it's accurate. And I think for lots of introspection of importance in philosophy and the science of consciousness, we have no idea. We assume that it is, but it may not be. I think to address this issue, we need plausible psychological models of introspection. I don't think we have any. And so I try and give in chapter 7 some models where I focus on this idea of introspective attention. So I begin with Evans's procedure that gives an account of what I call simple introspection. And this involves a single attention channel. Evans pointed out in varieties of reference that we can just do something very simple to get introspection. We can begin with the machinery needed to give observational reports. Okay? So for example, if we're going to report T's, and a T occurs, let's say on the screen or in the world, and we visually experience it, this visual experience can inform this report, given that we intend to do that. So that's the machinery of observation and report. And Evans's point is that we just redeploy that, except in this case, we want to intend to introspect what we're experiencing. So the concept will be different. Now it'll have a psychological experiential concept, that of seeing, but the input machinery is still going to be the same. We just redeploy the same capacities. The nice thing about this is that the reliability of this structure is going to be built on our understanding the reliability of this structure, at least in part. Now, I'm not actually interested in simple introspection because that's actually most of the introspection in philosophy is of a complex sort. Consider the experience of blur. I'll just ask this of you. Do you think your peripheral vision is blurry? Now, that question has been answered negatively in debates about the metaphysics of perceptual experience. And it might be thought that it's just obvious by introspection, where you can introspectively tend to blur, and that would be simple introspection of a sort. However, I don't think that that's how it goes. And let me give you one example where I think it goes in a very different way, which is in the optometrist's office. So in the optometrist's office, you're sitting on the chair looking at a bunch of letters on the screen, and the optometrist gives you one lens to look through and then switches to another. And the task here is for you to note the difference, right? To tell the optometrist which lens is blurrier or which lens is clearer. It's one that's not the other. And here what I want to point out is that this is a working memory task. You've got to remember the previous lens to compare it in your mind to the present lens and to detect some difference, which will allow you to make a judgment about the other. This structure is not simple. It involves two attentional channels, okay? And this other element, which could be more than one, leads to questions about the accuracy of introspection because, for example, it opens up the possibility of theory ladenness, or a related worry is demand characteristics in psychology, where subjects figure out what the point of the experiment is, what the hypothesis at issue is, and then that informs their judgment. Okay? Or in the case of like discussion of how much we see, I think there's a lot of knowledge that subjects bring that influences what they report. Here's the point, though. We don't know what all the various influences are on introspection and how they might distort what we report. I've written, for example, on the rubber hand illusion and bodily ownership, where I think our reports are distorted by knowledge. Okay, so I think that's something that needs to be sorted out. And this is discussed in chapter 7 in detail by giving plausible psychological models of what we're doing in introspect. Okay, so that's a summary of some of the themes, not all the themes in each chapter. I hope that sort of whets your appetite for looking at it. I think, again, broadly speaking, it's a book about agency, covers these areas, and should be of interest to anyone who touches on action in their theorizing. So I hope you'll have a look at the book. Chapter 1 is available for free by download at the OUP website. And that will be available until April 30th. So please have a look on that. You can also read the introduction for free at this point right now on Google Books. So again, thank you for your attention, and I hope you check out the book.